The house was supposed to be empty. The deed clearly stated there were no current occupants, yet smoke was curling from the chimney, and someone had been tending the garden. Ezekiel Marsh surveyed his new property from atop his horse, watching a young woman hang freshly washed clothes on a clothesline that shouldn't have been there. She moved with the confidence of someone who belonged there, humming softly as if she owned every inch of the land he'd just bought. The journey here had taken 3 days across rugged terrain, following directions that had taken him farther from civilization than he'd ever been. This remote valley, nestled between towering hills and accessible only by a narrow mountain pass, was supposed to be his sanctuary, a place where a man could disappear from his past and build something new. The seller had assured him the property was vacant, untouched for years. But there she was, hanging a blue dress on the line with movements that spoke of routine, of home. Ezekiel dismounted and approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel path that led to the modest wooden house. The garden showed signs of careful cultivation, neat rows of vegetables, herbs growing in organized plots, not the wild overgrowth he'd expected from an abandoned farm. Someone had been living here, maintaining this place, treating it as their own. The young woman noticed him when he was about 50 yards away. She didn't startle or run. Instead, she straightened up, wiped her hands on her apron, and watched him approach with dark eyes that showed no fear, just a silent challenge that unnerved him. Her clothes were simple but clean. Her brown hair was pulled back with practical efficiency that suggested someone who worked with their hands. "You're on private property," she called out when he was close enough to hear her clearly. Ezekiel stopped, pulling the folded deed from his coat pocket. "Actually, ma'am, I believe you're on my property. I just bought this land from the Territorial Land Office. I've got the papers right here." She glanced at the document he held aloft, then back to his face, her expression unchanged. "Those papers don't mean much around here. My family's been working this land for longer than any office has been around to issue deeds." The certainty in her voice made him falter. She wasn't pleading or explaining. She was stating facts as she saw them with the calm authority of someone who'd never had reason to doubt her claim. Her feet were planted firmly on the ground, her shoulders squared. Everything about her posture suggested she had no intention of moving. "What's your name?" Ezekiel asked, keeping his voice level despite his growing confusion. "Clementine Ross. And yours?" "Ezekiel Marsh." "Look, Miss Ross, I understand there might be some confusion here, but I have legal ownership of this land. Perhaps we can discuss arrangements." "No arrangements are needed," she interrupted, turning back to her clothes. "This is my home. It's been for 22 years. I was born in this house and I'll die in it if I have to." Something in her tone made Ezekiel's chest tighten. This wasn't going to be the simple matter of asking a trespasser to leave. The young woman before him spoke with the conviction of someone who truly believed she belonged here, and her calm refusal to acknowledge his ownership suggested depths to this situation he hadn't anticipated. But as he watched her hang the last piece of laundry, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Carved into the wooden post that held up the clothesline was a name: Jonathan Ross, 1847. If that date was accurate, her family had been here long before any territorial office existed. And if she was telling the truth about being born here 22 years ago, then someone had sold him land that legitimately belonged to another family. Ezekiel stood motionless, staring at the carved name that seemed to mock his legal papers. Jonathan Ross, 1847. The numbers felt like an accusation, suggesting this land had been claimed and worked long before any governmental office ever set foot here to legitimize ownership. His carefully planned escape from civilization was crumbling into something far more complicated than he'd anticipated. Clementine finished hanging her clothes and walked toward the house, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She paused on the wooden steps leading up to the front porch, turning to study him with those dark eyes that seemed to see right through his discomfort. "You can stable your horse in the barn if you plan to stay," she said, her tone practical. "There's fodder and water, but understand this. You're a guest here, not the owner." The casual way she offered hospitality while simultaneously rejecting his ownership stung more than open hostility would have. She was treating him like a traveler who had stumbled upon her home, not as someone with legal claim to the property. Her confidence was absolute, unwavering, and it made him question everything he thought he knew about this purchase. "Miss Ross, I appreciate the offer, but we need to settle this matter of ownership. I paid good money for this land, and I have documents. Papers issued by people who've never set foot on this soil," she interrupted, settling herself on the porch steps. "Tell me, Mr. Marsh, what do you know about the man who sold you this property?" The question caught him off guard. He'd dealt with a territorial agent in the nearest town, a man named Coleman, who had seemed eager to close the deal quickly. The price had been remarkably low for such a substantial piece of land, something Ezekiel had attributed to the remote location and lack of nearby settlements. Agent Coleman handled the transaction. He said the previous owner had died without heirs. The property reverted to territorial control. Clementine's laugh was bitter, sharp as broken glass. "The previous owner died without heirs? That's interesting, considering I'm sitting right here." She gestured to the surrounding farm. "My father built this house with his own hands. My mother planted that garden. Both are buried on the hill behind the house, and I've been tending their graves for 3 years." The weight of her words settled on Ezekiel like stones. If she was telling the truth, then Coleman had either flat out lied about the state of the property, or the territorial agent had been misinformed or had deliberately sold land that wasn't his to sell. The thought of being swindled made his jaw clench, but it also raised darker questions about what other lies he might have been told. "If that's true, then why isn't your name on any official record?" "Because women don't inherit property under territorial law," she said with silent fury. "When my father died, the land should have gone to my brother. But Marcus disappeared 2 years ago, and suddenly the territory decided we didn't exist." The mention of a disappeared brother opened another door Ezekiel hadn't expected. His brother's disappearance could explain the confusion over the property, but it also suggested there were more layers to this story than a simple property dispute. "What happened to Marcus?" Clementine's expression hardened, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she looked away from him. "That's a dangerous question, Mr. Marsh. Some disappearances in these parts aren't meant to be investigated." The warning in her voice made the hairs on his neck prickle. He'd come here seeking isolation and peace, but it seemed he had stumbled into something far more sinister than a property dispute. The implications of Clementine's warning hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. He'd traveled for days through increasingly isolated terrain to reach this valley, passing no other settlements, seeing no signs of civilization beyond this single farm. If people disappeared here, who would even know? Who would come looking? "What do you mean, dangerous?" he asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Clementine stood up from the porch steps and walked to the edge of the garden, her fingers brushing the wooden fence her father had built. "This valley isn't as empty as it seems, Mr. Marsh. There are men who use the remote passes for business they don't want witnessed. My brother found that out the hard way." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the farm, and Ezekiel found himself noticing details he'd missed before. The house windows could be locked from the inside. The garden fence was built higher than necessary to keep animals out. Even the barn's location offered a clear view of the mountain pass he'd used to enter the valley. This wasn't just a farm. It was a fortress designed by people who understood the need for vigilance. "Your brother saw something he shouldn't have seen," she continued. "Marcus was always curious, always exploring. One night he followed strange riders through the pass, thinking they might be traders or settlers. He came back different, scared in a way I'd never seen him before." Clementine's voice dropped to just above a whisper. 3 days later, he rode out to check the northern boundary markers, and never came home. Ezekiel felt the familiar knot of fear that had led him to seek isolation in the first place. He'd thought that distance would protect him from the violence that had marked his past, but it seemed he had simply traded one type of danger for another. "I searched for him for weeks, found his horse wandering near the Colorado River Gorge, saddlebags intact, no sign of a struggle. It was as if he had simply vanished." She turned to face him directly. "But 2 days after Marcus disappeared, Agent Coleman showed up asking questions about our family, about who had legal claim to this land." The timing seemed more than coincidental to Ezekiel. If Coleman had appeared so quickly after Marcus's disappearance, it suggested that the territorial agent had been watching the Ross family, waiting for an opportunity to claim their property. "Do you believe Coleman was involved in your brother's disappearance?" "I believe Coleman knows more than he admits about who controls the passes through these mountains. And I believe whoever bought this land from him is either part of his operation or about to become a very inconvenient witness." The weight of her words settled on him like a death sentence. He'd paid Coleman for what he thought was legitimate property. But if the agent was connected with what had happened to Marcus, then Ezekiel had unknowingly gotten himself involved in something far more dangerous than a property dispute. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of horses echoed from the mountain pass, multiple riders moving at a steady pace that suggested familiarity with the terrain. Clementine's face paled, and she moved quickly toward the house. "How many people know you're here?" she asked urgently. "Just Coleman and the clerk who processed the paperwork." "Then those riders don't bring good news." She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "You need to decide right now, Mr. Marsh. Are you with me, or are you going to trust the man who sold you stolen land?" The sound of approaching hooves grew louder, and Ezekiel realized that his peaceful escape from civilization had become a fight for survival. Ezekiel didn't hesitate. Something in Clementine's desperate urgency convinced him that anything coming through that pass meant danger for both of them. He grabbed his rifle from his saddle and followed her toward the house, his boots thudding against the wooden porch as the sound of hooves grew closer. "How many?" he whispered as they reached the front door. "At least 4, maybe more." Clementine quickly locked the windows from the inside, her movements practiced and efficient. "They always travel in groups when they're moving cargo through the valley." "What kind of cargo?" "The kind that needs to disappear from civilization for a while." She handed him a loaded pistol from a drawer, her eyes never leaving the window. "Stolen goods, wanted men, sometimes worse." Through a gap in the windows, Ezekiel watched 5 riders emerge from the tree line. They moved with military precision, their horses well-trained and their gear expensive. These weren't random vagrants or desperate bandits. They were organized, professional, and clearly familiar with this route. The lead rider was a tall man with a distinctive scar running from his left ear to his jaw. He dismounted near the garden fence and gestured for his companions to spread out around the property. His eyes swept the farm with the calculating gaze of someone who had done this before. "Coleman promised this place would be empty by now," the scar-faced man called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Does someone want to explain why there's smoke coming from that chimney?" One of the other riders, a younger man with nervous energy, shifted in his saddle. Maybe the new owner arrived early. The new owner was supposed to be handled. The scar-faced man's tone carried a threat that made Ezekiel's stomach clench. "Coleman said he'd make sure our route remained clear." Clementine grabbed Ezekiel's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "They're talking about you," she whispered. "Coleman didn't just sell you this land, he set you up." The realization hit Ezekiel like ice water. His purchase hadn't been a legitimate transaction. It had been bait. Coleman had sold him property he couldn't legally own, then informed these men exactly when and where to find him. He had willingly walked into a trap designed to eliminate the only witness to their criminal operation. "We need to get out of here," he said. But Clementine shook her head. "There's only one way in or out of this valley, and they're controlling it. We're trapped until they leave or we make them leave." The scar-faced man approached the house, his hand resting casually on his pistol. "I know there's someone in there. I saw the curtains move. Why don't you come out and we can discuss this like civilized folk?" Ezekiel felt sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. These men clearly had killed before. Their confidence and casual threats spoke of experience with violence. But running wasn't an option, and surrendering seemed like a guaranteed death sentence. "There might be another way," Clementine whispered, moving to the back of the house. "My father built a tunnel from the root cellar to the barn. If we can get there unseen, we could reach the horses. What about your belongings, your home?" Her face hardened with resolution. "This house has already cost my family too much. I won't let it cost us our lives too." But as they moved toward the cellar entrance, the sound of splintering wood echoed from the front door. The waiting was over. The criminals were coming in. If you're enjoying this story of suspense and adventure, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our thrilling narratives. We have a lot more incredible content waiting for you. The cellar entrance was hidden under a loose floorboard in the kitchen, concealed so well Ezekiel would never have found it without Clementine's guidance. She lifted the board with practiced ease, revealing a narrow opening just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The tunnel beyond disappeared into darkness, a lifeline carved out of desperation and foresight. "My father finished it that first winter," she whispered, as they descended into the cramped space. Said a man always needs an exit others can't see. The tunnel was roughly dug but solid, supported by wooden beams that spoke of careful construction. As they crawled through the narrow passage, Ezekiel could hear the men above ransacking the house. Their heavy footsteps accompanied by the thud of overturned furniture and kicked-in doors. "Where's the woman?" The scar-faced man's voice carried through the floorboards. Coleman said there might be a girl still living here. Maybe she ran when she saw us coming. Nobody runs from this valley. Check every room, every hiding spot, and find that tunnel. These old farmers always had escape holes. Clementine froze in front of him, her body stiff with terror. "They know about the tunnel," she breathed. The passage suddenly felt more like a tomb than an escape route. If the men knew to look for hidden exits, they'd find the barn entrance in minutes. Ezekiel's mind raced, trying to calculate his options as the sound of systematic searching continued above them. "How did they know?" he whispered. Clementine's voice was barely audible in the cramped space. "Marcus, when they caught him, he must have told them about our defenses, our escape routes. They extracted the information from him somehow before making him disappear." The casual certainty in her voice that her brother had disappeared, that he had been taken against his will, hit Ezekiel like a punch to the gut. She had been living with this knowledge for 2 years, trapped in this valley with the men who had made her family disappear, waiting for them to decide her fate. They reached the end of the tunnel just as the sound of discovery echoed from the house. "Found it! There's a tunnel entrance in the kitchen floor." The barn was 20 yards across open ground. Their horses were saddled and ready, but reaching them meant exposing themselves to gunfire from multiple directions. Ezekiel peered through the narrow opening, counting the men he could see positioned around the property. "They're surrounding us," he said. "Not all of us." Clementine pulled a small leather pouch from her pocket, her movements deliberate despite their desperate situation. "Marcus left me something before he disappeared. Something he said would bring justice if anything happened to him." She opened the pouch and removed a folded paper, its edges worn from handling. Even in the faint light filtering through the tunnel opening, Ezekiel could see that it was covered with names, dates, and detailed descriptions. A record of everything he witnessed. Names of the men involved, descriptions of their cargo, dates and routes of their operations. Marcus documented everything before they got him. The paper represented more than just evidence. It was a weapon that could destroy the entire criminal network, but it also explained why Coleman had been so eager to sell Ezekiel this property and why these men were so determined to eliminate any witness. "That's why Coleman wanted you gone," Ezekiel realized. "As long as you're alive, you're a threat to their operation. And now I am too." Clementine looked him in the eyes in the darkness. "The question is, what are we going to do about it?" The sound of boots approaching the barn made the decision for them. They could surrender and face certain death, or they could fight with the slim hope of exposing the truth. But as the footsteps stopped directly above the tunnel entrance, Ezekiel realized that his time for planning had run out. A voice called out in the darkness, "We know you're down there. Come out now or we'll have to smoke you out." Ezekiel pressed himself against the tunnel wall, his mind racing through impossible options. The voice above them belonged to the scar-faced man, and his casual tone suggested he was accustomed to cornering people with nowhere to run. Beside him, Clementine clutched her brother's documentation with white knuckles, the papers representing both their salvation and their damnation. "We're not coming out!" Ezekiel yelled back, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. A low chuckle echoed through the tunnel. "That's unfortunate. It makes this whole situation more complicated than it needs to be." The sound of liquid being poured followed his words, and the unmistakable smell of kerosene began to filter through the opening. "They're gonna smoke us out," Clementine whispered, horror creeping into her voice. The implications hit Ezekiel immediately. The tunnel had only one exit behind them, back into the house that was already under the criminals' control. Forward meant climbing into the barn where armed men waited to capture them, but staying meant being smoked out in an increasingly tight space. "There might be another way," Clementine said suddenly, pressing her hand against the side wall of the tunnel. "Marcus told me he'd modified the tunnel, added a second exit that not even our father knew about. Something about learning from prairie dog burrows." Her fingers traced along the wooden support beams until she found what she was looking for, a section where the earth had been carefully dug out and concealed. Behind a thin layer of earth and grass, another passage opened toward the hillside behind the barn. If we can reach the graveyard where our parents are buried, there's a rocky outcrop that provides cover. From there, we could work our way around behind them. The smell of kerosene grew stronger, and wisps of smoke began to filter into the tunnel. The scar-faced man had set fire to the barn entrance, creating a literal wall of fire between them and escape. But his arrogance could also be their opportunity. He clearly believed they were trapped with no alternatives. How long is the secondary tunnel? Maybe 30 yards. It comes out near my mother's grave marker. 30 yards of crawling through an even narrower passage as smoke and fire chased them from behind. It wasn't much of a chance, but it was better than surrendering to men who had already demonstrated their willingness to torture and kill. As they squeezed into the hidden passage, Ezekiel heard the scar-faced man's voice growing more impatient. The smoke is thickening down there. Last chance to come out on your own. The secondary tunnel was barely wide enough for their shoulders, forcing them to crawl on their bellies through loose earth that crumbled around them with every movement. Clementine led the way, her intimate knowledge of the property being their only hope of emerging in the correct spot. Behind them, the main tunnel began to fill with smoke as the fire gained strength above. The crackle of burning wood provided cover for the sound of their movement, but it also reminded them that retreat was no longer possible. Almost there, Clementine whispered, as the passage began to slope upward, toward the surface. But as they approached the exit, the sound of voices made them freeze. The criminals had placed guards at strategic points around the property, including apparently near the family graveyard. They could hear at least two men discussing whether the fire was strong enough to force their prey out. "Should have brought more kerosene," one voice grumbled. "Relax. They'll either come running out or surrender. Either way, Coleman will be satisfied that they were captured." Clementine's face was set with determination as she carefully pushed aside the vegetation that concealed the tunnel exit. The graveyard lay 15 feet away. Two graves marked by simple wooden crosses and a small stone monument. Beyond, the rocky hills offered the cover they desperately needed, but between them and safety were two armed men who would shoot them the moment they emerged from hiding. Clementine studied the two guards through the tunnel opening, her eyes calculating distances and angles with the precision of someone who had learned survival out of necessity. The men were positioned near her father's grave, their attention divided between watching for fugitives and monitoring the growing fire in the barn. "The one on the left limps," she whispered to Ezekiel. "War wound, probably. He'll be slower to react if we can create a distraction." Ezekiel was amazed by her composure under pressure. While he felt panic clawing at his chest, she was analyzing their enemies with clinical detachment, planning her next move as if this were a game of chess rather than a fight for life or death. What kind of distraction? Instead of answering, Clementine carefully removed several loose stones from the tunnel wall. Her movements were deliberate, purposeful, and Ezekiel realized that she was implementing a plan that had been forming since they entered the hidden passage. "My brother taught me something about creating opportunities," she said, weighing the stones in her hand. "Sometimes you have to make people look the wrong way." She launched the first stone far to their right, where it shattered against the wooden fence enclosing the garden. Both guards immediately turned to the sound, their weapons raised and ready. The second stone followed quickly, landing even further away, and creating the impression of someone moving through the vegetation. "Now," Clementine breathed, and they emerged from the tunnel like shadows. The 15 feet to the stone monument felt like a mile, but they reached cover just as one of the guards yelled to his companions, "Movement by the garden! They might have found another way out." From behind the monument, Ezekiel could see the full layout of the farm for the first time. The barn was completely engulfed in flames now, sending thick smoke into the evening sky. 3 men were positioned around the house. 2 more watched the main tunnel entrance, and the 2 near the graveyard brought the total to 7. More than he had initially counted. "We're outnumbered and outgunned," he whispered. "But we have something they don't," Clementine responded, pulling out her brother's documentation again. "Information." Marcus didn't just record their criminal activities. He documented their weaknesses, their fears, their connections to powerful people who wouldn't want their names associated with this operation. She pointed to specific entries on the worn pages. "The scar-faced man's name is Vernon Blake. He's wanted for murder in 3 territories, but he's been protected because he provides security for a territorial judge's illegal business ventures. Marcus found out which judge. The implications were astounding. If the documentation exposed corruption at the judicial level, it represented a threat that extended far beyond this remote valley. Coleman wasn't just facilitating crime. He was part of a network that reached the highest levels of the territorial government. That's why they had to eliminate your family completely, Ezekiel realized. Any witness could bring down the whole structure. And that's exactly what we're going to do. Clementine's voice carried a determination that made him believe, despite their desperate circumstances, that they truly could survive this. But first we need to get this information to someone who can act on it. The sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Through the smoke and gathering darkness, new riders were entering the valley. But these weren't reinforcements for Blake's men. The approaching group moved with different formations, different equipment, and most importantly, approached from a direction that suggested they had used a different route into the valley. Territorial marshals, Clementine breathed, recognizing something in their posture that Ezekiel couldn't identify. But Blake also had seen the newcomers, and his reaction was immediate and violent. Get the two of them now. We can't let them reach those marshals. Suddenly, the graveyard erupted into confusion as Blake's men abandoned their patient siege and launched a desperate assault. Warning shots echoed through the air, and shards of stone flew from the monument as Ezekiel and Clementine pressed themselves against its base. The approaching marshals spurred their horses to a gallop, clearly recognizing the sound of confrontation. But they were still several minutes distant, and Blake's men advanced with the fury of desperate criminals. As the warning bullets whistled overhead, Clementine grabbed Ezekiel's arm with desperate intensity. If I don't make it out of this, you have to promise me something. Take Marcus's documentation to the marshals. Make sure our family's sacrifice means something. But Ezekiel wasn't ready to accept defeat. Not when they had come so close to exposing the truth. Ezekiel rose from behind the monument, Marcus's documentation clutched firmly in his hand, and did something that surprised even himself. Instead of cowering from the advancing armed men, he stood tall and shouted over the tumult, with a voice that carried across the entire valley. "Marshal, Vernon Blake is here, wanted for crimes in 3 territories. I have evidence of corruption involving Judge Morrison." The effect was immediate and devastating. Blake's confident advance faltered when his men realized that their identities and connections had been exposed. The scar-faced leader's face paled with rage and fear, understanding that his protected status had just evaporated in the face of territorial law. "Get him now!" Blake shouted. But his men's attention was divided between the advancing marshals and their exposed positions in the graveyard. The lead marshal, a grizzled man with steel-gray hair, raised his rifle and fired a warning shot that cut through the air over Blake's head. Territorial Marshal Davis, "All weapons on the ground immediately, or we will use force." What followed was not the prolonged confrontation Ezekiel had expected, but a rapid collapse of Blake's operation. Faced with trained law enforcement and exposed identities, 3 of Blake's men immediately threw down their weapons and raised their hands. The 2 remaining loyalists tried to resist, but were quickly overpowered by the marshals. Blake himself made a desperate attempt to reach his horse and escape through the mountain pass, but Marshal Davis had anticipated this movement. A well-aimed shot hit his leg, dropping the scar-faced criminal 20 yards from the cemetery. Blake was quickly captured, putting an end to his reign of terror in the remote valley. While the marshals secured the scene and attended to the wounded and prisoners, Ezekiel handed Marcus's documentation to Marshal Davis. The veteran lawman's eyes widened as he read through the detailed records of criminal activities, corrupt officials, and systematic abuse of territorial authority. "This is extraordinary work," Davis said, looking up from the papers. "Your brother documented enough evidence to bring down a network we've been investigating for 2 years. Judge Morrison, Agent Coleman, and at least a dozen others will face trial because of his courage." Clementine's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of relief more than sorrow. Marcus didn't die for nothing. Your brother's sacrifice will save countless other families from suffering the same fate, the marshal assured her. "And this land will be returned to your family's rightful ownership. Coleman's fraudulent sales are being investigated throughout the territory." 3 weeks later, Ezekiel stood on the same porch where he had first encountered Clementine. But everything had changed. The property legally belonged to her now, Coleman was awaiting trial for fraud and conspiracy, and Judge Morrison had been removed from office pending criminal proceedings. Clementine emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, her movements more relaxed than he had ever seen them. The constant vigilance that had marked her every action was gone, replaced by the peaceful confidence of someone who could finally rest secure in her own home. "So, what happens now?" she asked, sitting down beside him on the porch steps. "I suppose I'll need to find another place to disappear," Ezekiel said, though the prospect held less appeal than it once had. "Or you could stay and help me rebuild what my family lost." Clementine's offer was simple, direct, and it carried the weight of everything they had survived together. "This valley is big enough for 2 people who understand the value of having someone to trust." Ezekiel looked over the peaceful farm, the repaired barn, the thriving garden Clementine tended with such care. He had come here seeking isolation from his past, but instead he had found something far more valuable. A purpose worth fighting for and a person worth protecting. "I'd like that," he said, and he meant it. The house he had bought in the middle of nowhere had brought him exactly what he was looking for, just not in the way he had expected. If you've made it this far, it's because you truly appreciate good stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to receive notifications for all our thrilling narratives. Also, leave a like if you enjoyed this story, and tell us in the comments what your favorite part was. We love hearing what you think. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing quality content. Until the next adventure.